On a night when the Minnesota blizzard buried roads and silenced the town of Pine Valley, a battered German shepherd dragged a black bag into the hospital. Inside lay medicine, a blood-stained map, and a desperate plea to save a child's life. What followed was a fight against time, snow, and grief itself. Before we dive into this incredible story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Could loyalty and courage turn a storm into salvation? Stay with me. The automatic doors at Northwind Regional Medical Center parted with a sigh, letting in a blade of air so cold it bit through scrubs and old bones alike. Snow shouldered its way across the lobby floor in powdery gusts before the doors fell shut again, muffling the storm's howl to a distant freight train hush. Dr. Henry Collins stood beneath the fluorescent glow that made everything look a little too clean and a little too unreal, a styrofoam cup warming the ache of his hands. 64 winters had taught him to read weather the way a surgeon reads an X-ray. This one was the hard kind, the kind that strips a town down to what it believes in. He had planned a quiet last shift clear a locker sign, a cake fake a smile. But the night had other plans. The glint hit first a scatter of ice crystals clinging to fur blown in like spark-off steel. Then the shape resolved low, powerful limping. A German shepherd breached the threshold soaked to the skin, chest heaving in shallow bursts. He was large but gaunt, the kind of dog that once filled doorways and now seemed to fold into himself to move forward. Mud slush and something darker streaked his flanks. One ear lay half-cocked, torn at the tip, the other pointed like a flag that had survived a storm. The dog paused as the doors hissed closed behind him. People froze, an orderly with a bin of fresh linens, a volunteer wheeling a half-decorated tree toward the pediatric wing, 2 EMTs thawing in the corner after a call. Even the vending machines seemed to hold their breath. "Whoa," said Frank Morales from security, a calm man with a state trooper's posture and a grayer mustache than last year. His hand hovered near his belt radio, not on his baton. He didn't want this to be a scene. Neither did Henry. The shepherd's paws left a pattern of melting snow and diluted blood across the polished tiles. In his jaws he held something canvas black, the corners scuffed to gray. A satchel. The strap dragged whispering on the floor. The dog moved not with the darting panic of lost pets, but with the deliberate focus Henry had seen in triage on nights when the elevator doors parted and the room decided without words to make space for what mattered. Henry stepped forward, not fast, knees complaining coffee set aside on the reception ledge. The dog's amber eyes found his. There was intelligence there, but more than that purpose, the kind that outlasts training. The shepherd's breath came in rough pulls that carried the wild scent of snow and road salt and wet leather. "Easy boy," Henry said, rough voice, pitched low as if addressing a frightened veteran wired to jump at sudden light. "You're inside. It's warm. Nobody's going to hurt you here." The dog shifted his weight and winced, lifting his right forepaw a fraction before he set it back down out of need rather than choice. Blood had clotted between his pads and then thawed again, leaving a tacky sheen. The satchel bobbed in his mouth as he adjusted his bite. "Emily," Henry said without turning because he knew she was there. He always knew where Nurse Emily Carter was on shift, the way farmers knew where the weather was. Warm blankets and a towel. On it she answered, her voice brisk and young but carrying a steadiness that came from somewhere old. 28 steady hands, eyes too clear for this hour. She vanished down the hall and reappeared with a stack hugged to her chest. "We should clear the lobby," Frank said softly to the EMTs. "Folks give the animal room." They did because there are moments when Americans from any county, in any winter, recognize the script that must be followed. Make space, keep quiet, let the right person step in. Henry raised his hands, open palms forward. "I'm Henry," he told the shepherd as if names bridged the distance between species. The dog blinked snowmelt from his lashes and made a small sound deep in his throat that wasn't a growl so much as a warning that he was calculating, not surrendering. His gaze slid to Emily, who had crouched 6 feet away, setting a blanket on the floor like an offering and spreading the towel over it. "You're safe," she murmured. "You look like you've had a night." A siren wailed somewhere outside and Dopplered away, and the dog flinched a tiny jerk a tell. Henry logged it. The shepherd had been near something loud, something chaotic, perhaps a roadway or worse. The satchel thudded once against the tile when the dog repositioned his jaws. Frank took a half step, and the shepherd's lips twitched fast, quiet a flash of white that said, "Not yet." Henry set one knee down a controlled descent that made his joints spark in protest. He felt the old hospital's chill kissing through the fabric of his pants, the ache settling in. He remembered uninvited another winter and a different lobby when Margaret had walked in smiling under a wool hat alive and amused at his refusal to wear a scarf. He blinked the ghost away. "I'm going to come a little closer," he said. "I won't take your bag. I just want to see you." The shepherd watched his hands the way a good cop watches a suspect's shoulders. Emily breathed beside him an anchor. The dog's chest worked. He shifted. Then, as if reaching a conclusion, he broke the distance on his own terms. 2 limping steps forward, then another. Then he eased the black satchel onto the towel with the same care Henry used to set a newborn down, reluctant to let it go, but gentler than anyone expected. The strap curled like a question mark. He kept one paw on it. His head dropped one ear at half-mast breath, clouding in small puffs that smelled faintly of gasoline and something medicinal. The move wasn't surrender. It was delivery. "Good boy," Emily whispered the words, calm and unbright. She slid the blanket's edge forward and folded it under the satchel, making a small island of warmth on the cold floor. The shepherd did not look at the blanket. He looked at Henry, and in that gaze was an insistence that paralleled the long nights Henry had spent telling frightened families the truth, and then walking with them into the next hour. This dog wanted something understood. Frank angled himself so the line of sight to the dog's flank was clear. "He's cut along the ribs," Frank said. "Not deep, but he's lost some blood." Henry nodded. He could see the tacky fur, the crusted maroon, the place where frost had clung and then melted. "Let's get him to Bay 2, Henry said, and only after he'd said it did he hear what he had done claimed the animal as a patient. Emily's smile ghosted brief and grateful. She glanced at the satchel. "Do we open it?" "Not here," Frank said. "If it's nothing, we're fine. If it's something, we want eyes and a controlled space." He spoke without drama, but Henry heard the silent list of somethings that justified caution, a firearm contraband or something fragile and time-bound that a careless hand could ruin. The shepherd nudged the satchel with his nose and made a quiet sound that was almost a plea hurry. The power flickered then. The generator hiccuped, lights dimming to a softer, meaner blue that made everyone in the room look like they had spent a week underwater. The storm leaned hard against the building, as if making up its mind to test masonry as well as men. "Let's move," Henry said. Emily rose first, then crouched again, letting the dog read her intention the way one reads the wind at a frozen lake. She slid her hands to the satchel and met resistance. The dog's paw stayed planted. "We're taking it with you," she promised. "Together." The shepherd lifted his paw. Emily gathered the strap and Henry eased a hand to the dog's collar and found none. What he felt instead was a webbed harness with a torn edge and a small plastic mount near the shoulder, empty as if something had been ripped away by force or weather. He filed it because details became lifelines later. Rex Henry said, trying the name as if taste-testing a memory he didn't have. The shepherd's ear twitched toward him. "All right," Henry said, decision settling like a coat across his shoulders. "Rex it is." The dog allowed the touch, allowed the guidance, allowed Henry to take a sliver of his weight as they steered him toward the corridor. Every foot of that hallway had a history, and Henry felt all of them as they turned toward Bay 2, the midnight births, the uncertain waiting, the long goodbyes. Tonight, the place felt like a church after the last hymn, the air holding whatever prayer had just been sung. Emily pushed the swinging door with her shoulder. "Blanket on the table," she said. "Frank, can you alert radiology? We may need imaging on a canine, and maybe call Dr. Avery from the therapy animal program. She's on call for weekends." Frank was already speaking into his radio voice, steady, adding a quiet request to loop administration. Henry didn't love that, but he understood it. Hospitals ran on two fuels, compassion and policy. He lifted the dog's forequarters and felt the tremor ripple through muscle and bone. "Easy," he said. "You're doing just fine." The shepherd slid onto the prepared table head high, eyes fixed on the satchel as Emily set it within his line of sight. The wind clawed at the windows again. Somewhere a monitor chimed sweet and indifferent. Henry leaned on the table's edge, catching the dog's gaze. "You brought this to us," he said. "We're going to listen." For a second, the room narrowed to those amber eyes and the fragile push of breath between them. Then Rex's paw lifted a deliberate slow movement, and he placed it on the black satchel as if to say, with the gravity of any old soul carrying one last message through bad weather, "This first, and then you can tend to me." Henry glanced at Emily, and in that single look agreement passed between generations. The old doctor would handle the pain. The young nurse would handle the lock. Together, they would handle the night. The small examination room hummed with the low vibration of the generator, its light a pale blue wash over stainless steel and white tile. Dr. Henry Collins adjusted his glasses, the frame slightly bent from years of slipping in and out of pockets, and leaned over the black satchel that now rested on the table beside Rex. The shepherd's chest rose and fell unevenly, but his eyes never wavered from the bag as though it were an anchor keeping him awake. Emily Carter stood opposite Henry, gloved hands hovering near the zipper, her breath catching in the cool air. Frank Morales had taken his post near the door, the radio clipped to his shoulder, muttering with intermittent storm updates. And though his voice remained steady, his gaze was sharp with the awareness that whatever lay inside that satchel mattered more than protocol tonight. Henry drew a slow breath, aware of Emily's anticipation, and together they tugged the zipper open, careful not to startle Rex. The sound was small but loud in the hush, a rasp that seemed to scratch at every ear in the room. Inside, folded with surprising precision, were medical vials cradled in a cloth that had absorbed enough blood to turn its edge dark brown. The labels were familiar insulin solutions packed for field stability, not the kind left in a household fridge, but the sort shipped for emergencies, portable and expensive. Emily's eyes widened. She recognized instantly the difference between life and death sitting right there. Next to the vials was a folded sheet of paper spotted with dried red smudges. Henry lifted it with his fingertips, unbending the creases slowly so the paper would not tear. The handwriting struck him first, hurried, uneven but not careless. Someone had written while fighting against time, against panic, against the cold. The message was short, brutal in its economy. "Sophie needs this. She will not last the night. Mark has lost his way. Please help us." Beneath the words, a shaky line of ink trailed off as if the pen had slipped from numb fingers. Henry's heart slowed in a way it did when realization carved through him. Sophie, a child's name. The medicine matched the diagnosis without explanation needed. He looked across the table at Emily, whose face tightened, her lips parting as if to breathe in more than air grief memory determination. She whispered the name as though trying to steady it in the room. "Sophie." Henry lowered the note and his eyes traveled to the remaining item in the bag, a folded map torn along one edge, the fold softened from repeated use. The surface speckled with dried droplets, the color of rust. Emily slid it closer and smoothed it against the steel. It was a regional map of the county, printed years back, judging by the outdated logo in the corner, but a bold marker line cut through the snowbound roads, leading from the highway to a point deep in the forested hills, where only one structure had been drawn by hand, a square-marked cabin. A circle had been scrawled around it with such force the paper had nearly ripped. Frank shifted his weight, his boots scuffing softly. "That's 6 miles past the last plowed line. No one's clearing it tonight." His voice carried the matter-of-fact gravity of a man used to snow rescues and their consequences. Emily leaned closer to the map, her finger tracing the marked route. If Sophie is there and she's already in crisis, she won't make it to morning without this. She glanced at the vials, her eyes sharp with clinical calculation. This dose buys hours, not days. Henry folded the note carefully, pressing the crease as though giving it respect. "Whoever wrote this knows the clock better than we do," he said. Then let silence carry the weight of the obvious. The writer was likely the child's mother, Laura, pleading for strangers to intervene before her daughter's body failed her. Rex stirred, lifting his head just enough to glance at the paper, then at Henry as if urging motion. The shepherd's body trembled not from fear, but from the stubbornness of pain resisted too long. Henry reached out, resting his palm near the dog's harness without touching the wound. "You carried this for her," he murmured. "You walked through that storm because someone trusted you more than anyone else." Emily wiped her glove across her forehead, though no sweat clung there. "If this is real," she said softly, "then there's a child out there who's slipping closer to coma with every hour we debate." Frank cleared his throat. "And if it's a setup, we've all seen traps laid stranger than this. A bag at a hospital door could be bait." Henry's gaze moved to the vials again, their labels clear, their purpose unquestionable. He shook his head slowly. "No one bleeds on a note and folds it with medicine like this to lure a hospital into a storm. This is desperation, not manipulation." Emily nodded, her jaw set. She leaned toward Rex, her voice firm. "We'll go, won't we? You're not finished leading us yet." The shepherd blinked, then pressed his paw against the satchel once more as though sealing the vow. Frank shifted, glancing at the window where wind rattled against glass like a drum roll. "Even if you're right, the roads are gone. Radios fade out past the ridge, and I doubt we'll find help if trouble waits out there." Henry folded the map with deliberate care and slid it back into the satchel. "Trouble's already waiting. We just don't know its shape yet." His voice was calm, but edged with something Emily had learned to recognize in months of working under him. When Henry spoke in that tone, he had already decided what mattered most. Rex exhaled, his muzzle lowering to the table, his eyes flickering but still watching. The message had been delivered. The choice lay with them. Outside, the storm lashed harder against the building as though testing resolve before they stepped into it. Henry pressed his palm flat against the table. "We'll need a plan," he said. Emily straightened, eyes flicking to the clock calculating the hours Sophie might have left. Frank pressed his radio again, speaking quietly to dispatch about the map, about the possibility of a cabin deep in the hills. The static answered like a ghost, thin and unreliable. The power flickered once more, dimming the room before it steadied as if reminding them of the fragility of the night. In that thin silence, Henry looked again at Rex and saw in the old dog's endurance the answer to their hesitation. If he had survived the journey to bring the message, then they had no excuse to turn away. The map and note lay spread across the metal table, their presence heavier than any storm outside, and Dr. Henry Collins kept his gaze fixed on the writing until the room blurred. His breath caught in his chest, not from age alone, but from the sudden, sharp pang of recognition. The uneven loops of the letters, the slanted angle of the words, the way the writer pressed harder on the descenders, all of it pulled him back decades. He whispered the name before he realized it had slipped past his lips. David. Emily Carter turned her head quickly, surprised by the personal tone, while Frank Morales crossed his arms, waiting. Henry steadied himself against the table edge, memories crowding his mind. David Dalton had been more than a colleague. He had been a friend in the days when Henry was just starting his residency, a man who stayed late shifts with him, a man who once trusted Henry enough to share stories about his troubled younger brother and the grief that stalked their family. Henry had not seen him in almost 20 years. There had been a Christmas card one year, then silence. He blinked, clearing the blur, and set the note down carefully as if the fragile connection between past and present might tear. "I know who wrote this," he said, his voice hushed but certain. Emily leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Who?" Henry swallowed. "David Dalton. He was a doctor once. He left medicine early after personal tragedy. This handwriting, it's his. I'd stake my license on it." Frank frowned. "Dalton. That's the same last name as the man you mentioned earlier in training, the one who lost a daughter to diabetes complications." Henry nodded slowly, the weight of the revelation pressing down. Mark Dalton was his younger brother, the same brother who spiraled after the loss. If David wrote this note, it means he was there trying to save that child, and if Mark is involved... His words trailed the implication, chilling the room more than the draft creeping under the door. Emily's face drained of color. "You're saying the kidnapper might be Mark Dalton, David's own brother?" Henry pressed his fingertips against the table, grounding himself. "Yes. It fits too well. The grief, the anger at hospitals, the obsession with insulin." Frank shifted uncomfortably. "We can't act on a hunch. We need more than handwriting." As if on cue, Rex stirred. His head lifted ears, twitching eyes sliding toward his harness. Henry noticed the faint blink of a small red light embedded near the strap. "There's a camera," he murmured. Frank knelt, unclipping the device with careful hands. The small unit was battered, streaked with snow and dirt, but still powered. He placed it on the counter and connected it to the nearby monitor with a cord he dug from a drawer. The screen flickered, then steadied, and the room leaned in as the grainy footage rolled. At first, the images showed snow whipping past at low angles, the perspective of Rex himself charging forward, then halting as a figure entered frame. The officer, unmistakably David Dalton, older, now heavier around the shoulders but still recognizable, stood beside a police SUV calling into his radio, his voice taut with urgency. He moved toward footprints, the camera bouncing as Rex followed. Then another figure burst into frame, rough, frantic, wielding something metallic. The man's face turned toward the lens for a brief, frozen instant, enough for Henry to feel his stomach drop. Mark Dalton. The years had carved deeper lines into him, but the resemblance to David was undeniable. The same jaw, the same set of the brow, but twisted by rage and desperation. The screen jolted violently as the officer went down the view, spinning snow spraying until Rex took off the sound of distant shouts fading into the storm. The footage ended abruptly with static. Silence filled the room, punctuated only by the hum of the generator and the wind clawing at the windows. Frank exhaled slowly. "That's proof enough. David was there. He sent the dog. Mark is the one holding that child." Emily clenched her fists, her shoulders trembling with controlled emotion. If Mark is willing to let a child suffer just to make someone else feel his pain, then Sophie doesn't have much time. "We can't wait." Henry rubbed his temples, feeling the pulse of an old friendship beating painfully against the present. David must have been hurt. He tried to leave us the tools, medicine, a map, a plea. He knew Rex would reach us. That means he believed we'd follow through. Emily's voice sharpened. "And we will. We have no choice." Frank glanced at the storm raging outside, then back to the two of them. "If we're stepping into this, we'd better prepare. Once we leave the hospital, there's no support until morning." Henry's eyes returned to Rex, the dog who had carried not only the satchel, but a message across the storm. The shepherd's amber gaze met his steady and fierce despite exhaustion. In that look, Henry saw the reflection of an old promise to stand by those who needed him, no matter how close to the end of his own road he felt. He drew a breath, his decision firming with it. We go tonight. The blizzard won't stop us, and neither will Mark. The hospital's command room was tense with static as the satellite phone crackled and died in the middle of a dispatcher's message. Dr. Henry Collins stood near the window watching the storm pile snow against the glass in furious waves. The world outside was unrecognizable, a shifting white wall that erased streets, buildings, and any hope of conventional rescue. Frank Morales lowered the receiver slowly, his expression dark. The county crews are grounded. Plows can't push through drifts that high, and the National Guard convoy turned back an hour ago. No one's coming until daylight. The words hung in the air with finality heavier than the storm's roar. Emily Carter gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles pale. "That's 6, maybe 8 hours," she said quietly. "If Sophie is already in crisis, she won't survive the night." Frank glanced at her, then at Henry. "You've seen the footage. You know what's waiting in those woods. A blizzard, a desperate man with a grudge, and a child whose life is a clock running out. We can't send anyone out there without backup." Henry pressed his hand against the satchel on the table, feeling the hard shape of the vials beneath. "We don't need anyone else," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of his years. "We have Rex, the map, and the medicine. That's enough." Frank's eyes hardened. "You're 63 with arthritis in both knees. She's a nurse barely a few years into practice, and the dog is bleeding from his flank. This isn't a rescue team, it's a death wish." Emily raised her chin, her voice low but firm. "Then I'll take the risk." Both men turned to her, startled by the steel in her tone. She stepped closer to Henry, her eyes fixed on him. "You want to know why my little brother Daniel was diagnosed with type 1 when he was 8? One night his glucose crashed so fast my parents didn't recognize the signs. By the time they reached the ER, it was too late. He was gone before sunrise." Her hands trembled as she spoke, but her voice remained clear. "I promised myself I would never stand by again when someone's child was slipping away. Not if there was something I could do. Sophie is out there, and I'm not going to let her share Daniel's fate." Henry felt his chest tighten not from age but from the sharp edge of her conviction. He remembered Daniel's file faintly, the hospital record from years ago when Emily was still in college, the tragedy that shaped her path into nursing. He saw not recklessness in her eyes, but determination born of pain. Frank sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. "If you go, you're on your own. I can't authorize it. And if you don't come back—" His voice trailed off, unwilling to finish. Henry picked up the map, folded it carefully, and slipped it back into the satchel. "I'm not asking for authorization. I'm asking for gas in the snowmobile and enough supplies to last us until dawn." Frank stared at him for a long moment, then finally nodded. "You'll have them, but I still think it's madness." Henry turned to Emily, the flicker of a smile softening his lined face. "Madness or not, we'll need every ounce of your training tonight." Emily's eyes shone the grief and resolve of years converging into a single moment. "I'm ready." Rex shifted on his paws, his body stiff but his gaze bright as though he understood the decision had been made. He padded toward Henry, pressing against his leg in silent allegiance. Henry rested a hand on the shepherd's thick fur, feeling the warmth of loyalty beneath his palm. "Then it's settled," he said. "We leave as soon as the snowmobile is fueled." The storm hammered against the walls as if in protest, rattling the windows and moaning through the cracks. The hospital felt smaller now, its walls no longer a sanctuary, but a cage keeping them from the task ahead. Emily pulled on her thermal jacket, fastening the zipper with deliberate movements. "We'll need flares, blankets, and spare fuel. If the storm shifts, we could be stuck longer than planned." Henry nodded, already calculating the weight the snowmobile could bear against the need for speed. Frank busied himself gathering supplies, his disapproval obvious but his loyalty deeper than protocol. He returned with a radio that crackled uselessly, then replaced it with a satellite phone, pressing it into Henry's hand. "Batteries won't last long," he warned. Use it only if you have no other choice." Henry accepted it, tucking it into the satchel alongside the vials. Emily checked Rex's harness, fastening the strap snugly around his chest. The shepherd bore it without protest, though his breath came heavier than before. She brushed his muzzle, gently whispering, "You got us here, boy. Now you're going to lead us the rest of the way." Rex blinked slowly, his amber eyes steady as though offering assurance. Henry slung the satchel over his shoulder, feeling its weight like a burden and a purpose all at once. He looked around the command room one last time, the place where 43 years of medicine had taught him to measure life in minutes and choices. Tonight, that training would be tested far from sterile lights and stocked shelves out in the wild storm, where there were no second chances. Frank held the door as they stepped into the corridor, the emergency lights casting their shadows long against the floor. "Bring her back," he said simply. Henry nodded. "We will." They walked toward the service exit, where the snowmobile waited, the sound of the engine already warming against the cold. The blizzard's howl seeped through the cracks around the door, a reminder of the wall they were about to face. Emily adjusted her gloves, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. Henry placed a hand on the handle, glanced at Rex, then at Emily. For a moment he saw not a nurse and a dog, but companions chosen by fate, bound together by loss and loyalty. With a firm push he opened the door to the storm, the night swallowing them in snow and wind. The snowmobile cut a fragile path through the storm, its headlight a thin blade carving the white wall ahead. Dr. Henry Collins gripped the handlebars tightly, his gloved hands stiff against the vibration. Behind him, Emily Carter held on, her body tense but balanced, and Rex crouched against them, muscles taut, eyes scanning the darkness with a focus that ignored his injury. The satchel pressed against Henry's side, a constant reminder of what carried them forward. The forest rose like a shadowed cathedral, trees bending under heavy ice branches, cracking in protest against the wind. The crude map guided them across frozen fields and into winding trails where even the snowmobile struggled. Henry slowed, following the inked line that matched the slope of the ridges and the dip of a narrow creek. Emily leaned close to his ear, her voice barely audible above the engine and storm. "Half a mile more," she said, reading from the folded map in her mittened hand. "There should be a road cut through these woods, old county access." Henry nodded, steering into the bend. The headlight caught the glint of metal ahead, half buried in snow. He braked sharply, the machine jerking as it slid to a stop. Emily gasped, recognizing the vehicle even before they reached it on foot. It was a compact SUV, doors ajar, snow piled inside, glass frosted white. The plate was visible under the rim of ice, and she scraped it clean with her glove. Her breath caught. "Miller," she whispered. "This is Laura Miller's car, Sophie's mother." Henry's stomach tightened. He circled the vehicle slowly, scanning for clues. The driver's side showed streaks of blood against the steering wheel, faint but undeniable. Snow had softened footprints around the tires, yet the impression of small boots lingered, half swallowed by new drifts. He crouched, examining the tracks. 2 adults, he muttered, one dragging something heavy, and here smaller prints. A child. Emily closed her eyes briefly, imagining Sophie stumbling through the storm, her body weakening with every step. They didn't get far, she said. They had to stop somewhere. Rex paced around the vehicle, nose pressed to the snow. He circled twice, then froze his body, stiffening tail, rigid ears forward. A low growl rumbled in his throat, so deep it vibrated through the storm's howl. Henry straightened quickly. "What is it?" Boy Rex's head lifted his nose, pointing sharply into the tree line beyond the SUV. His growl deepened, rising to a sharp bark that split the night. Emily felt her pulse spike. "Someone's out there." She reached instinctively for Henry's arm, her eyes darting into the swirling snow. At first there was only white and shadow, the storm disguising shapes, but the hairs on the back of Henry's neck rose with certainty. They were not alone. He crouched near Rex, whispering firmly, "Easy. Stay sharp." The shepherd's gaze locked on the trees, his entire body leaning toward the unseen presence. Emily drew a flashlight from her pack and swept the beam across the forest. For a second, the light caught something, a flicker of movement too deliberate to be wind. A figure shifted behind a trunk, then vanished deeper into the storm. Henry's voice dropped. "We're being watched." The realization struck cold, colder than the wind. Whoever had taken Sophie and Laura had not vanished into the blizzard. They were aware of the pursuit. Emily's grip tightened on the flashlight. If it's Mark, he knows this terrain better than we do. He could be leading us into a trap. Henry's eyes narrowed. Or testing how far we'll follow. Rex barked again, straining against the harness, eager to chase. Henry held him back, knowing reckless pursuit would scatter them into blindness. He forced his breathing steady. "We move carefully. Stay close. He wants us nervous. Don't give him that." Emily nodded, her jaw clenched. She swept the beam one more time, but the figure was gone, swallowed by snow and silence. The forest closed in again, branches heavy with ice shadows shifting in the wind. Henry returned to the snowmobile, his mind racing. The abandoned SUV confirmed they were on the right trail. The unseen figure confirmed they were being tracked in turn. Sophie was alive somewhere beyond, but every mile deeper into the storm bound them closer to the man who had set this nightmare in motion. Emily climbed back on her voice, steady though her hands trembled. "He knows we're here now. He won't make it easy." Henry glanced at Rex, whose amber eyes burned in the headlights' glow. "Nothing about this was ever going to be easy," he said. With that, he started the engine. The snowmobile's roar swallowed quickly by the blizzard as they pressed forward deeper into the unknown. The snowmobile ground to a halt at the edge of a clearing, its headlights slicing across the dark mass of a structure hunched against the storm. The cabin looked abandoned at first glance, roof sagging under heavy snow, windows, frosted chimney long cold. But Rex stiffened, nose-high body taut with recognition. He pulled toward the porch, every muscle straining, his instincts certain. Dr. Henry Collins killed the engine, and the sudden silence made the forest stillness louder than any machine. Emily Carter slid off the back, her boots sinking deep into drifts, and gripped Henry's arm. "This is it," she whispered, breath steaming. Henry nodded grimly, scanning the cabin. There were tracks in the snow, some heavy and dragging, some light and staggering, disappearing beneath the porch. A faint glow pulsed behind the shutter's candlelight or lantern too weak for electricity. He motioned for Emily to stay close, his other hand keeping Rex steady as they approached. The wood of the porch creaked under their weight, and Henry pressed his ear to the door. At first he heard nothing but the storm pressing against the walls. Then a sound slipped through labored breathing, small and shallow, the unmistakable struggle of a child in distress. His chest tightened. Emily's eyes filled with alarm, and she mouthed the name, "Sophie." Henry placed his hand on the knob, found it locked, then tapped lightly. The breathing inside shifted, followed by the slow scrape of a chair against the floor. A voice answered, low and hoarse, threaded with bitterness. "You came." The door swung inward a crack, and Mark Dalton's face emerged from the shadows, gaunt and wild eyes hollow with sleepless rage. He held a lantern in one hand, its flame trembling, and in the other clutched tight between his fingers a vial of insulin. Behind him on the floor, Laura Miller knelt beside her daughter, wrapping blankets around Sophie's small body. The child's face was pale lips, dry, her breaths shallow gasps. Laura looked up, her eyes brimming with desperate relief at the sight of Henry and Emily, then widened with fear as Mark pressed the vial higher, shaking it slightly like a threat. "Not one step," Mark hissed, voice raw. "You think you can walk in here and fix everything?" "No, not until she understands." He pointed toward Laura, his hand trembling. "On your knees. Beg me for it. Beg me the way I begged doctors who didn't listen, who turned their backs, while my little girl slipped away." Laura's hands tightened on Sophie, her tears streaking her cheeks. She whispered, Please, Mark. Please give it to her. She's innocent." Mark's jaw clenched the storm outside, rattling the shutters like an echo of his fury. Henry stepped forward, his voice firm but calm, honed from decades of breaking news no one wanted to hear. "Mark, listen to me. I know what happened to your daughter. I know your pain. But Sophie is not your enemy. She doesn't deserve to pay the price for your loss." Mark's eyes darted to Henry, recognition flickering. "Collins," he muttered. "David trusted you. He said you cared. But where was care when my daughter needed it? Where was it when her blood sugar dropped and no one came fast enough?" His hand shook so violently the vial rattled in the dim light. Emily swallowed hard, her heart pounding as she looked at Sophie's weakening form. She stepped forward, her voice breaking but strong. "Mark, I know what it feels like to lose a child to this disease. My brother was only 8. One night his glucose crashed and we didn't make it in time. I watched him fade in my mother's arms. I would give anything to change that. But you still can. You can stop another family from feeling the same loss. You can give Sophie a chance." Mark blinked, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second, but then anger surged back, twisting his features. He thrust the vial higher. "You say you'd give anything. Then prove it. I want her to crawl. I want her to beg like I did on her knees." Laura's sobs filled the cabin, her hand stroking Sophie's damp hair. She whispered, "I'll do whatever you want. Just please let me give her the shot." She started to lower herself, her knees pressing into the cold wood floor, but Henry raised his hand quickly. "No," he said, his voice sharp but steady. He met Mark's eyes, refusing to look away. "Humiliation won't bring your daughter back. What you're holding isn't power, Mark. It's medicine. It was made to save, not to punish. Your brother knew that. David sent Rex because he still believed you could remember it too." Rex growled low, his amber gaze fixed on Mark, but Henry kept his voice calm, measured every word deliberate. "You're standing between death and life right now. You can choose which way this ends." Mark's breath came ragged, his hand wavering. Laura clutched Sophie tighter, the child's chest rising in shallow, uneven motions. Emily's eyes shone with tears, but she spoke again, softer now. "Mark, she's slipping. You have minutes, maybe less. If you want your daughter's memory to mean something, let it mean this, that you saved another life when you still had the chance." The storm battered the cabin wind, shrieking through the cracks as if the night itself was waiting for his choice. Mark's knuckles whitened around the vial, his face torn between rage and grief, while Sophie let out a faint whimper that cut through the noise like a plea from the edge of life itself. The cabin air was heavy with damp wood-wax smoke and the sharp tension of a man unraveling. Mark Dalton stood rigid, the vial of insulin trembling between his fingers, his grief twisting into cruelty. Laura Miller remained on her knees beside her daughter, whispering prayers, stroking Sophie's limp hand. Sophie's chest rose unevenly, each breath a fragile spark threatening to flicker out. Dr. Henry Collins knew the signs too well. The child was slipping into ketoacidosis, and without immediate intervention, minutes would steal her away. Emily Carter's heart pounded, her training screaming for action, yet she held her place, knowing one sudden move could endanger them all. Rex crouched near Henry, a steady growl deep in his chest, his eyes fixed on Mark as though waiting for the command to act. Henry met Laura's desperate gaze, then shifted his own downward, silently urging her to steady Sophie just a little longer. Laura's eyes widened with understanding, and she adjusted the blanket shielding her daughter's frail body partly from Mark's line of sight. Henry kept his voice calm and measured the voice of decades spent speaking over the roar of grief. "Mark, let me look at her. Just look. You have nothing to lose by letting me examine her." Mark's jaw clenched, his breathing ragged, but he gave a short nod. One look. No tricks. He stepped back half a pace, gripping the vial higher like a warning. Henry knelt slowly, his knees protesting the cold floor. His hands moved with the ease of habit, steady despite his pounding heart. He slid his bag closer under the guise of checking Sophie's pulse. Emily shifted subtly, her body blocking Mark's view as she unfolded a sterile packet from her sleeve and slipped a small syringe into Henry's hand. It was a maneuver rehearsed not in training but in shared understanding, two medical professionals bound by the urgency of saving a child. Henry's fingers closed around the syringe, his thumb steadying the plunger. He pressed his stethoscope briefly against Sophie's chest, murmuring soft words as though narrating vital signs, and in that motion slid the needle gently into her arm beneath the blanket. Sophie flinched weakly, too far gone to resist, and Henry depressed the plunger with deliberate calm, delivering the life-saving dose. Emily lowered her head, whispering encouragements to mask the faint hiss of the injection. Laura bit her lip hard enough to draw blood, holding her daughter close while tears slipped down her cheeks. The syringe withdrew, hidden instantly beneath the blanket. Henry's hand steadied on Sophie's wrist, pretending to measure a pulse as the medicine began its fight inside her bloodstream. For a moment the storm seemed to hold its breath with them, but Mark's eyes narrowed. His grief-honed instincts caught the shift, the unnatural stillness of three people sharing a secret. His face twisted with realization, and his voice cracked like a whip. "What did you do?" He lunged forward, snatching the blanket aside. His gaze fell on the small red dot where the injection had been given. Rage exploded across his face. Not the fury of betrayal alone, but the terror of a man losing control of his narrative. He roared, "You tricked me," and hurled the lantern to the floor, shattering glass, filling the cabin with the acrid stench of burning oil. Shadows leapt violently against the walls. Rex barked, launching forward, his body slamming between Mark and the child. Mark swung wildly, striking the shepherd with a heavy piece of firewood he seized from the hearth. The blow landed with a sickening thud, and Rex yelped, collapsing against the floorboards, his flank bleeding fresh where the wound tore deeper. Emily cried out, rushing toward him, but Mark shoved her back with a force that sent her stumbling into the table. Henry's hands rose instinctively, not in surrender, but in desperate appeal. "Mark, stop. It's done now. She has a chance. Don't take that away from her." Mark stood over Rex, chest heaving, the improvised weapon dripping resin and blood. His hand trembled as he raised it again. Yet he hesitated. His eyes locked not on Henry, but on the shepherd sprawled at his feet. The dog, though battered and bleeding, lifted his head weakly, growling low, refusing to retreat. The defiance in Rex's gaze mirrored something human, something Mark recognized and could not strike down. His arm faltered, lowering inch by inch. He turned his rage back toward Henry, but instead of striking, he stepped away, pacing in jagged circles, muttering, "You think saving her changes anything? You think one dose erases what I lost?" His voice cracked, grief surging beneath fury. "My daughter begged me to, and no one came. No one." Henry rose slowly, placing himself between Mark and Sophie, his old frame steady as stone. "You're right," he said softly. "Nothing erases loss. But taking more won't heal you. It will only bury you deeper. Look at her, Mark. Look at Sophie. She's breathing stronger already." Mark's gaze flicked to the child. Sophie's chest, though still weak, rose with steadier rhythm. Her small lips parted with a deeper breath than before. Laura wept, clutching her daughter, whispering thanks through sobs. Mark's weapon slipped from his grasp, clattering against the floor. He pressed his hands against his temples, torn between rage and remorse, his body shuddering as though fighting two masters inside him. Emily knelt beside Rex, pressing her hands against the bleeding wound, her own tears streaking down her cheeks. "Stay with us, boy," she whispered fiercely. Henry watched Mark reading the fracture lines in his soul. The battle was far from over, but something inside him had cracked, and in that crack was the faintest light of humanity struggling to return. The lantern's shattered glass smoldered on the floor, filling the cabin with a haze that stung eyes and burned lungs. Mark Dalton's shoulders heaved as if every breath were drawn through the weight of his grief. His hands streaked with soot, and Rex's blood trembled violently as he picked up a shard of broken wood sharp enough to serve as a weapon. Dr. Henry Collins stood steady, his frame tall despite age, his eyes fixed not on the weapon, but on the man holding it. Laura Miller clutched Sophie to her chest, whispering prayers while Emily pressed her palms against Rex's wound, her voice coaxing the shepherd to hold on. Mark staggered toward Henry, eyes blazing, mouth twisted in rage. "You took my choice." He spat, his voice ragged. "You dared make the decision for me the same way they all did when they let her die." He raised the jagged wood high, poised to strike. Henry did not flinch. Decades in emergency rooms had taught him that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand anyway. He locked eyes with Mark, his voice calm. "If you believe ending me will bring her back, then do it. But if you look inside yourself, you'll see she never wanted this for you." The words cracked something deeper than anger. Mark's hand shook violently, the shard hovering above Henry's chest. But his gaze blurred. In that haze, another scene surged forward, unbidden, the memory of a small bedroom lit by a nightlight shaped like a butterfly. His daughter curled under blankets, her cheeks flushed with fever. He saw her hand in his fragile fingers, clutching his own as she whispered, "Daddy, stay." The weight of the memory buckled him. His arm faltered, his breath hitched, and the weapon wavered. He staggered back half a step, clutching his forehead as though the memory itself had struck him harder than any blow. In that sliver of hesitation, Rex stirred. Despite the blood seeping into Emily's hands, the shepherd dragged himself upright, legs trembling, body weaving. His growl rumbled low, building strength from loyalty alone. He pushed forward until he stood between Henry and Mark, his chest heaving, his fur matted with blood, but his eyes burning with defiance. He planted himself as a shield, refusing to move. Mark froze, staring at the animal, swaying on weak legs, yet standing unyielding. The sight pierced through rage like nothing else could. He saw in Rex the same devotion he once saw in his daughter's eyes, the same stubborn will to protect, even when there was nothing left to give. His arm dropped lower, the shard slipping from his fingers, clattering harmlessly against the wooden floorboards. For a moment, the storm outside roared louder than the men inside, pressing against the cabin as though it demanded the final choice. Mark fell to his knees, burying his face in his hands, torn between grief and shame. "I only wanted her back," he whispered, voice cracking under the weight of sorrow. Henry placed a steady hand on Rex's back, feeling the tremor of the dog's body, steadying both of them with his touch. "No one can bring her back, Mark," he said softly. "But you can honor her by letting Sophie live, by letting this end differently than it did for you." Emily looked up from Rex, her face wet with tears, her hands slick with blood. She whispered fiercely, "See him, Mark. Even injured, he protects. He refuses to give up. That's what your daughter would have wanted for you to protect, not destroy." Laura rocked Sophie gently, the child stirring faintly with stronger breaths as the insulin took hold. She lifted her tear-streaked face toward Mark. "You don't have to be the man who takes. You can be the man who saves. Please let us take her home." Mark lifted his head slowly, his eyes hollow yet flickering with the fragile spark of something breaking free from the cage of grief. He looked at Sophie, her small chest rising more evenly now, then at Rex, who swayed but refused to yield. His lips trembled as he whispered, "She used to call him her guardian. Said every child should have one. Maybe I forgot what that meant." His voice cracked, and for the first time tears spilled freely down his face. Henry stepped closer, speaking gently but firmly. "It's not too late to remember. Let us walk out of here together. Sophie alive, Rex standing, you still her uncle, not her captor." Mark bowed his head, his arms dropping limp at his sides, the fight draining out of him. Rex leaned against Henry's leg, his body giving way but his spirit refusing to collapse entirely. The room held its breath, the moment suspended between ruin and redemption. And in that silence, Mark whispered, "Take her. Save her. I can't carry this anymore." The storm outside raged with a violence that rattled the very beams of the cabin, every gust a howl that made the walls shudder like frail bones against nature's fury. Inside, the air was heavy with tension and the raw ache of choices just made. Mark Dalton remained on his knees, shoulders slumped, the shard of wood lying forgotten on the floor beside him. Dr. Henry Collins steadied Rex, feeling the faint tremor of the shepherd's body against his leg, while Emily Carter pressed cloth to the wound that refused to stop bleeding. Laura Miller rocked Sophie gently, her whispers soft and steady, coaxing the child toward life. Just as Henry opened his mouth to speak, to tell them they must leave before the storm crushed the cabin entirely, a sound like a rifle crack split the night. Above them, the roof groaned under the weight of snow and ice timbers flexing until a massive branch, long weakened, finally gave way and crashed down through the roof. The blow was deafening, filling the room with a blizzard of splinters, dust, and snow. Mark, still kneeling near the center of the room, was struck directly by a falling beam. The impact drove him sideways, pinning his shoulder and chest beneath jagged wood. His cry was more shock than anger, cut short as he struggled to breathe, his face twisting in pain. Laura screamed, clutching Sophie closer as Henry lunged forward on instinct. He heaved against the beam, his aging muscles straining, but the weight was immense. Emily darted to his side, hands grasping the edge, her face set with fierce determination. "We can't leave him," she gasped through the dust. Henry's jaw tightened. Logic whispered to abandon the man who had brought them here, but medicine, his oath, and his humanity left no room for that choice. "On 3, Henry commanded. Together they braced, lifting enough for Mark to drag his body halfway free, though blood poured from a deep gash along his ribs. Rex barked weakly, staggering closer despite his wound, his instincts driving him to guard even now. Emily pulled strips of cloth from her coat, pressing them firmly to Mark's bleeding side. His face was pale, eyes clouded, but not with rage. This time only with pain and something close to regret. "Why are you helping me?" he rasped. Henry knelt beside him, his voice steady. "Because life is worth saving no matter what has come before. If Sophie deserves a chance, so do you." Mark's eyes filled with tears that spilled silently into his beard. Emily worked quickly, improvising a tourniquet with practiced hands, her mind sharp despite exhaustion. "He's lost a lot of blood," she said. "But if we stabilize him, he has a chance." Laura watched, stunned, as the same people he had tormented now fought to preserve his life. Sophie stirred faintly in her arms, her weak voice whispering, "Help him, Mama." The child's words struck deeper than any plea could. Rex whined softly, his head lowering onto Henry's knee as if urging them to hurry. Henry turned to the shepherd, his hand smoothing the blood-matted fur. "We won't forget you, old boy," he murmured, signaling Emily to bring more supplies. Emily shifted between Rex and Mark, tending first to the dog's flank with practiced care, stitching enough to hold, then returning to Mark's wound. Each motion was driven not by anger, but by duty, each breath affirming the fragile line between despair and redemption. Snow continued to swirl through the gap in the roof, but the worst of the collapse had passed. Still, the cabin moaned with each gust, reminding them they could not remain. Henry glanced at Laura. "We'll need to move both of them to safety as soon as Sophie is strong enough to travel." Laura nodded, her eyes still locked on Mark's face. His breaths came shallow but steadier now, his gaze unfocused yet softer than it had been since their ordeal began. "I never wanted it to end like this," he whispered hoarsely. "I thought anger was the only thing I had left." Henry placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Anger burns everything in its path. But tonight, you have a chance to let something else remain." Emily pressed down on the bandage one last time, ensuring it held. Her voice softened as she leaned close. My brother died of the same illness that nearly took Sophie. I couldn't save him, but I'll be damned if I let anger or grief take anyone else tonight. That includes you." Mark blinked, stunned by the raw honesty. A shaky breath left him, and for the first time his expression was not defiance, but acceptance. Outside, the wind shifted the storm, beginning to ease dawn, hinting at its slow approach. The snow still fell, but lighter, as though even nature was allowing them a moment's reprieve. Henry guided Rex onto a makeshift stretcher fashioned from broken boards and Emily's scarf, then secured Mark's torso with whatever cloth remained. Laura followed close. Sophie bundled safely against her chest, her eyes closing in exhausted relief. Together battered but alive, they stepped out into the snowbound dawn, a fragile procession of the broken and the healing. Every step forward was heavy, but each carried them closer to redemption. The snowcat rumbled steadily toward Pine Valley General, its treads cutting deep lines through the drifts, the dawn sky opening pale and uncertain above them. Inside the vehicle, the group huddled together in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Dr. Henry Collins sat with Rex's head across his lap, feeling the dog's shallow breaths against his palm. Emily Carter knelt beside them, adjusting the makeshift bandage every few minutes to slow the bleeding. Across the cabin, Laura Miller cradled Sophie the child, now sleeping deeply, her breathing steady and warm against her mother's chest. Mark Dalton, pale and silent, leaned back under guard, the lines of pain etched across his face, his eyes fixed not on anyone in the vehicle, but on some distant memory only he could see. When the snowcat finally reached the hospital bay, the emergency team was already waiting, alerted by radio. Paramedics rushed Sophie inside Laura, following close behind her, voice cracking with gratitude as she called back over her shoulder. Thank you for bringing us home." Another team carefully lifted Rex, his body limp but alive, into a stretcher bound for the veterinary wing the hospital had prepared in emergency. Henry followed alongside, never letting go of the shepherd's paw until the surgery doors closed between them. Emily remained with Mark as orderlies wheeled him toward a different wing, the psychiatric unit, where he would face long months of treatment. She looked at him, once her expression not filled with anger, but with the weight of everything they had endured. "You're still here because someone believed you could be more than your mistakes," she said softly. Mark nodded faintly, tears welling in his eyes, but said nothing. Hours later, Henry stood by Sophie's bedside, watching the monitors hum steadily. The insulin had stabilized her blood sugar, her cheeks flushed with renewed color. Laura sat nearby, her hand wrapped tightly around her daughter's relief etched into every line of her face. She looked up at Henry, her voice trembling. "You didn't just save her. You saved me, too." Henry smiled faintly, exhaustion pressing heavily on his shoulders. "She saved herself," he said gently. "We just gave her the chance." In the days that followed, news of the storm rescue spread quietly through the hospital corridors, whispered from staff to patients until it became something more than rumor, something closer to legend. The story of the retired doctor, the young nurse, and the battered shepherd who had braved the blizzard to save a child's life carried weight that even administrators could not ignore. One evening, as Henry was gathering the last of his belongings from his locker, the same routine he had begun weeks earlier before everything changed, Dr. Melissa Grant. The hospital director entered the room. Her heels clicked softly against the tile as she approached a folder clutched in her hand. "Henry," she began, her voice more formal than usual, though her eyes softened as they met his. "The board met this morning. Officially, your retirement papers were to take effect yesterday." Henry chuckled wearily, closing the locker with a quiet clang. "Yes, I suppose I missed my own farewell cake." Melissa smiled, then opened the folder. "The board has reconsidered. They've asked me to extend an offer. Not as an attending physician, you've more than earned rest from that, but as director of a new program, Pediatric Resilience Therapy. You'd oversee a team dedicated to helping children with chronic conditions adapt not only through medicine but through emotional support. Henry raised an eyebrow, curiosity flickering despite his fatigue. And where would I find such emotional support? Melissa set a photograph on the bench beside him. Rex recovering in the hospital therapy unit, his eyes bright despite the bandages along his flank. The board wants Rex to be the cornerstone of the program. A living reminder that loyalty, resilience, and courage can heal as much as medicine. The children already adore him. They're calling him their guardian. Henry picked up the photograph, running a thumb across the shepherd's familiar face. A warmth spread through his chest, cutting through the ache of exhaustion. And what would they call me? Melissa smiled. The man who refused to quit when the storm was at its worst. Henry thought of Margaret then, of her voice reminding him that there were no coincidences, only stories we had not yet recognized. He nodded slowly, his decision settling into place as naturally as breath. "Tell the board I accept," he said, slipping the photograph into his pocket. Weeks later, the pediatric wing bustled with new energy. Bright murals decorated the walls, laughter echoed in the halls, and at the center of it all, Rex padded calmly beside Henry, his gait slower but steady, his amber eyes watchful as ever. Children reached out eager hands to stroke his fur, their faces lighting up with joy. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor during one session, her cheeks glowing with health, her hand resting gently on Rex's back. "He saved me," she told the others simply. Henry, standing nearby, smiled at the truth of it. Rex had saved them all in one way or another. And now, together, they would continue to guard, to guide, to heal. And that's where tonight's story closes, though its echoes linger far beyond the storm. If you've been moved by Rex's loyalty and Dr. Collins's courage, let me know what moment struck you most. Was it the dog standing against the storm, the doctor refusing to surrender, or the fragile redemption of a broken man? I'd love to hear your thoughts and the city or town you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one, and if this tale left a mark on you, give it a like so others can find it too. Until next time, remember, sometimes the smallest act of loyalty can change the course of everything.